Bienvenidos a los Estados Unidos, Maduro, and to everyone else tuning in, welcome to my channel. I'm Dominique Hoffman, and welcome to the new year. It's 2026. We are off to a crazy start with the arrest of Nicolás Maduro of Venezuela. Under Hugo Chavez, the regime referendumed the constitution to allow for indefinite presidential terms. So for all intensive purposes, Chavez and Maduro were dictators propped up in power with the facade of free and fair elections. Before we look at the political rise of Chavez and the Chavistas, which have ruled Venezuela for the last quarter century, it's important to note that Venezuela suffers from what is called the Dutch disease or the resource curse, meaning that they are a single export economy. They do not have a diversified economy. We see this in a lot of global south countries that are mineral or resource rich. Because of this, the economy of Venezuela follows the boom-bust cycle of global oil prices. And this boom-bust cycle creates a volatile economic environment, which leads to political dissatisfaction, grievances, and unrest. Hugo Chavez rose to influence as early as 1980s, when there was a radical streak politically that followed the trends that were happening across South America, in Peru and Bolivia. Influenced by the 19th century Venezuelan revolutionary Simón Bolívar, military official Hugo Chavez establishes the leftist revolutionary Bolivarian movement 200 within the army. Now, this is also on trend for military juntas of the period. A lot of the unrest was mobilized amongst the military, which then turned on the government. The movement borrows from Bolivar's belief in a unified Latin America, but it also draws inspiration from the leftist Peruvian military junta of the 1970s. As a teacher at the Military Academy of Venezuela, Chavez gains a reputation for rousing lectures and pointed criticism of the Venezuelan government. He travels the country to recruit new members for his political movement. Now, I really quickly want to note his role as a political and academic critic of the Venezuelan government at the time. Because a lot of my friends who sit in political positions within the Trump administration will oftentimes laugh at me when I talk about the woke right, the influence of Tucker Carlson. But for example, Chavez was playing a long game. Ideological indoctrination starts academically. We saw that happen on the political left for the last 2 decades. And it is happening in a different way through the rise of new media on the American right. It's dressed up as an academic critique of American politics. Okay. So over the next decade, a ton of political unrest, and Chavez attempts a military junta or a military coup twice, once in February of 1992 and another time in November. He is then arrested, which only radicalizes the movement further. In 1998, Chavez is elected president. So after taking office in February of 2000, Chavez launches his plan Bolivar 2000, which includes anti-poverty programs. This is that part of his populist or communist promise to redistribute wealth. Now, also part of this plan is a constitutional referendum to expand the presidential term to 6 years. Now, Chavez and his policies are wildly detrimental to the Venezuelan people, and there is a lot of opposition to him and continued unrest. So in 2005, he creates a 2 million person civilian militia, and this is when we start to see the monopoly on violence under the Chavez presidency unravel. Under Chavez's leadership, roughly half of Venezuela's oil exports still go to the United States. Now, this is important. This is still back in 2005. But tensions between the two countries have increased due to Chavez's friendship with Cuban leader Fidel Castro and his vocal anti-American rhetoric. This is when we start to see the coalition build between Cuba, which is really not that big of a player, Russia, and China with Venezuela. In December, the opposition boycotts the National Assembly elections, giving Chavez's allies control in the legislature. Chavistas are now taking over the legislature. They also take over the judiciary. So we see the expansion of his powers, the consolidation of Venezuelans' rights. Now, in the process of this, free and fair elections go out the window. We see property rights being violated. Everything that empowers an electorate in a democracy becomes consolidated or eliminated. That's when we start to see the persecution of civilians who are trying to oppose Chavez's regime. In 2006, Russia and Venezuela signed a $2.9 billion arms deal. And this is when things start to heat up. Chavez in 2005 begins extensive travel abroad, strengthening relationships with Iran, Russia, and China. That axis of chaos, of which I would say Venezuela is one of the tertiary players in, started to form strategic alliances with these anti-Western powers. In 2006, Chavez continues to consolidate power. He creates a one-party government. So therefore, there is no coalition government to oppose Chavez politically. This is the further consolidation of his presidential powers. Chavez kicks off 2007 with a new mandate passed by the National Assembly, which at that point was almost completely controlled by Chavistas, and he replaces most of his cabinet, announcing the nationalization of telecom and electricity industries, as well as the central bank, and cancels the broadcast license of private media companies, including RCTV. He also proposes an act that gives him the power to rule by decree for 18 months. In April, Chavez announces nationalization of oil projects. So in 2008, the Human Rights Watch starts to report on human rights violations happening under the Chavez regime, namely discrimination on political grounds and open disregard for the principle of separation of powers. So again, at this point, Venezuela is no longer a democracy. It's been consolidated all under the power of Chavez and is governed by Chavistas. In 2009, it becomes a full-fledged dictatorship when there's a referendum on the Constitution to get rid of term limits. In 2009, the economy is now completely owned and controlled by Chavez. There is also a shadow economy emerging, which is the drug trafficking and drug trade, which is one of the reasons why the Trump administration went after Maduro. Chavez announces that Russia has opened a $2.2 billion line of credit for Venezuela to purchase arms. Now, the reason this is important is typically when a rogue state expands their military capabilities, you assume it is either to be used against their adversaries, which at this point, Chavez made it very clear that America was an ideological adversary to Venezuela, or their own people. In this case, it turned out to be as deterrence to political opposition within Venezuela. In 2011, this gets cancer, and in 2012, there's a large opposition movement forming, and there have been many opposition movements since then to try and oust Chavez and then his heir from political office. But as we saw in the last election, there is no longer free and fair elections in Venezuela. Maduro just stole the election, which again is very on trend for South America. Chavez dies in 2013, and then Maduro wins the election in 2013. Since then, the trend of political oppression, economic depression for Venezuelans, the shadow economy of drugs has become a huge issue and has eroded any political or economic infrastructure in Venezuela. It is a failed narco-terrorist state. Now, knowing all of this, it's really interesting to me that liberals who claim to champion human rights are outraged that Maduro was taken by the Delta Force. Why? Well, ideologically, it opposes their claim that the West, that the United States, is a neocolonial force trying to coercively take over or exploit global South nations. But in all reality, Venezuela was now given a chance to reconstruct a true democracy. Now, there are challenges to that, which I will name at the end of this video. But for all intents and purposes, Maduro being ousted and forcibly taken from government because all other avenues failed, including opposition coalitions, is a net benefit for Venezuelans, for the region, and for the United States. I always like to show the Freedom House score just to emphasize Venezuela is not free. It says Venezuela's democratic institutions have been deteriorating since 1999. Conditions have grown sharply worse in recent years due to harsher government crackdowns on the opposition and the ruling party's use of thoroughly flawed elections to seize full control of state institutions. The authorities have closed off virtually all channels for political dissent, restricting civil liberties and prosecuting perceived opponents without regard for due process. Emily Schrader posted this. Anyone who has a problem with Maduro being captured and brought to justice should review the following footage of what Maduro did to his own people. Now, remember that multi-billion-dollar line of credit to increase Venezuela's military? Yeah, it wasn't used against foreign adversaries. It was used against their own people, and here's a perfect example of that. As I noted, those who seek political change are punished. These are the faces of men who were either killed or taken political prisoner for opposing the Maduro regime. This is not unlike what's happening in Iran, by the way, which I will also touch on at the end of this video. On July 28, 2024, Venezuelans turned out to vote in large numbers despite more than a decade of systematic repression and human rights violations under President Nicolás Maduro. Hours after polls closed, the Electoral Council declared that Maduro had been reelected with over 51% of the vote, which this goes on to say was not authentic. Thousands of protesters took to the streets in demonstration, most of them peaceful, demanding a transparent and fair elections and fair counting of the votes, they were met with brutal repression. Human Rights Watch received a credible report of 25 killings during the protests across the country immediately after the election. Most of these killings occurred on July 29th and 30th, with most victims being under the age of 40 from low-income neighborhoods. Credible evidence gathered by Human Rights Watch points to the involvement of Venezuelan security forces in some of these killings. In other cases, activos appear to be responsible. This goes to underscore the political repression and oppression of the Venezuelan people, which we as the United States, as the democracy, the light upon the hill, have a responsibility to intervene on behalf of. Now, this idea is no longer popular thanks to the neo-Marxist, anti-colonialist left in America, and now the rising woke right and the isolationism movement within the GOP. So this brings us to America's response to all the political unrest of the last quarter century in Venezuela. The title of this video is When Hard Power Goes Hard. What is hard power? So hard power is defined by a country's military and economic capabilities. America is the global hegemonic power, which means that we have the strongest military and economy in the world. Now, because of that, we are the global superpower. Pax Americana defines the international system. Now, the countries that don't like that are the illiberal authoritarian regimes abroad, including China, Russia, Iran, Qatar, and Venezuela, to name a few. These anti-liberal regimes would love nothing more than for America to retreat in isolation. Now, our hard power only acts as deterrence if we're willing to use it in strategic situations, such as in Venezuela in taking Maduro. So the question, geopolitically and from a foreign policy perspective, as the global hegemonic power, is restraint and isolation or intervention. Now, the United States doesn't want to intervene in every conflict because that's very costly to the United States. And if we spread our resources, both economically or militarily, too thin and we fight everyone else's wars, it actually weakens us. So it's a very delicate dance between intervention and then complete isolation, which is what the woke right in America is calling for, which is to completely retreat from the global stage. I don't think this is an organic idea that emerged amongst the GOP. This has been a concerted strategic effort of those illiberal regimes, including Qatar and China, to fund media personalities such as Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens to popularize the idea that America would be better off if it retreated. The reason for that is because these countries, China, Russia, Qatar, Iran, could not rival the United States in any sort of conventional war to try and weaken U.S. hegemony or influence. So instead, they've taken the ideological route, and it has yielded significant change within the GOP's foreign policy attitudes. President Trump going into Venezuela is a costly signal not just to other illiberal regimes abroad, but to the GOP base that this is what a strong America looks like. Speaking about deterrence, going and capturing Maduro happened the morning Maduro met with Chinese representatives from the Chinese government. Apparently, Rubio was unaware of that. Now, the reason that is also important is because China has a vested interest in establishing a strong political coalition with South America. Not only does it expand their Belt and Road Initiative, but it also takes them geographically closer to the United States. The United States has always benefited from being geographically isolated. Canada and Mexico haven't really been our adversaries. And so there's an Atlantic Ocean and a Pacific Ocean between us and some of our greatest enemies. China has used Venezuela as an outpost to get closer to the United States. Now, the United States can't let that happen because it undermines our security and a prolonged and chronic lack of response to China's coercive influence and diplomacy in Latin America has been a green light to the Chinese. So things have been heating up in Venezuela and no one's really paid attention to it. Ironically, I started to notice because Tucker Carlson had a FARA registered Venezuelan agent on his podcast to talk about how great the Maduro regime really is, that I was like, someone has information or is aware of conversations between the US and the Maduro regime, and they had paid or orchestrated for Tucker to run interference for a potential US interference in Venezuela. So in July 2025, Department of the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control sanctioned the Cartel de los Soles, the Cartel of the Suns, as a specially designated global terrorist. And the cartel is run, it's a criminal enterprise. It is a shadow government of Venezuela headed by Nicolás Maduro himself. Under this sanction is what he will be tried for, which is conspiracy for drug trafficking, amongst other things. So this was issued back in the summer of last year. It's important to note what Secretary of State Marco Rubio had to say in response to opposition of Maduro's arrest. He said, Maduro is not the president of Venezuela and his regime is not the legitimate government. All true. Maduro is the head of the Cartel de los Soles, a narco-terror organization which has taken possession of a country, and he is under indictment for pushing drugs into the United States. So this is the official line, although Trump also came out and said that he is interested in Venezuela's oil. So let's look at opposition from the left to the news that Maduro has been indicted in the United States. So this is just one meme that I saw that I saved from some of my extremely liberal grad school peers. And the caption is naked imperialism. So this is the claim of the woke left, of Democrats largely, because the woke left has come to characterize the policy outlook of the entire Democratic Party. This tweet says, Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. Trump's attack on Venezuela is naked imperialism, blood for oil. Okay. First off, no blood for oil. The only blood that has been shed in Venezuela thus far is the Maduro regime attacking their own people, which we saw with the Humvees. What blood? Maduro was taken alive. This is not a war. This is not an act of war. This is not a declaration of war. This, as Marco Rubio said, is an illegitimate government by the omission of the Venezuelan people who all believe the 2024 election was rigged or stolen. But this is the prevailing argument on the left. As I mentioned when we talked about the Human Rights Watch, the irony is that the woke left is the party of human rights. And they're not celebrating the fact that a human rights violator was eliminated in Venezuela from oppressing his people. They're going to come to the defense of the Maduro regime, of which the Venezuelan people themselves do not want. And the irony of all of this is that these white liberals are whitewashing a situation and calling for the oppression and defending the oppressor, not the oppressed. Clark Lawson, who I really respect, he's a moderate, he reacted to the Trump is just going to steal Venezuela's resources argument that has emerged on the woke left, although it's also a prevalent argument on the woke right. And then I'm going to look at his take from a moderate perspective, because he is a self-proclaimed moderate, and then we'll segue into the woke rights response.
Steal Venezuela's resources. Their resources have already been stolen by a corrupt regime. Hello? We're going to, but at least they'll be able to eat when the US is the one who's doing it. Hello? Two things can be true at once. Oh my God, the way that you guys are comparing Trump to Maduro it's going to radicalize me. It's going to radicalize me. You guys need to step out of America because you are the most privileged fucks that you have no idea what goes on in the world because you are stuck in your TikTok, social media, I hate America, free Palestine bubble. Just because America has problems and that you don't like your own country doesn't mean that everybody who is against America is automatically better than America, okay? There are worse leaders than Donald Trump. I'm so sorry to break that news to you. Anyways, good night. I'm going to do a full post on this tomorrow, but actually.
The free Maduro rants are diabolical, and it just shows the ideological possession of the youth in the United States on the left and on the right, because that is something that has been echoed by the woke right as well. Maduro and his regime have exploited his own people for over a decade now. Venezuelans do not get to participate in their economy freely because it is run by Maduro's regime. There was a complete consolidation of private industry, media, the oil industry. It is one and the same with the regime. We just went through the timeline of that at the top of the video. The Venezuelan people have already been exploited. To act as if Donald Trump is now going to come in and exploit the Venezuelan people who have been exploited by their own leaders for decades is stupidity. And on top of that, they've been exploited by Iran, China, Russia, Qatar, who have formed an ideological coalition with Venezuela. What's going to happen next is not Trump come in and just suck up all their oil. The United States is going to have to be strategically involved in reestablishing a functional democracy within Venezuela in order to prevent a power vacuum or a civil war or another military junta from happening. Because remember, the Chavistas still control the military. Maduro's men still have all the guns. The United States is going to have some sort of what I predict to be a military or physical presence on the ground in order to deter a military junta. So Reconstruction period politically is going to happen in Venezuela before there's ever a trade agreement for Venezuelan oil between Venezuela and the United States. Now, once that is achieved, which again could take months to even years from now, Venezuela will likely privatize their oil industry. Remember, that was absorbed by Chavez and Maduro. From there, the US can purchase oil from Venezuela, which is a net benefit because then that means we don't have to go to our ideological adversaries abroad, i.e. Qatar or Saudi Arabia, and purchase their oil, because all that does is empower their economies and their political engines and machines, which are anti-American. So from a democratic perspective, for the people of Venezuela, it is a net benefit. And on top of that, if the downstream benefits the United States from a strategic security perspective to purchase oil from another democracy in the region, it's a net benefit all around. Clark made a second video, which I want to react to. He summarizes a lot of what I've already said in this video, but from a moderate perspective, I disagree with some of the things he said.
His you-know-what also needs to shut up. So as a moderate who is not a big fan of Trump, I have taken notes on our actions in Venezuela, and I want to share them with you. The first point I'm going to make is that, yes, Trump is not doing this because of drug trafficking, okay? We all know that. Even Venezuelans know that. This is about oil, and this is about geopolitical dominance. So
I don't think you can underscore the drug aspect of it. Trump's policy from literally day one, 2015, was to close the border and make America great again, strong again, and eliminate the black market in America, usually empowered by the drug cartels coming out of Venezuela. Yes, is the oil a part of Trump's overall strategic plan? Yes. However, you cannot underscore the threat of the narco-terror industry in the US, which has poured billions of dollars of drugs into the United States, which has led to crime, poverty, crippling addiction for your everyday Americans. This can be strategic on a number of fronts. What the Trump administration is doing is what the Israelis call the octopus doctrine. When they're fighting proxy warfare in the Middle East, the idea is to go after the head terrorist, not to go after the small cells, the tentacles, because if you go after one cell, it just regrows and pops up somewhere else. So the United States implemented a similar strategy to go after the head honcho of the narco-terrorist organization, Maduro himself, who's been using an entire country and its resources to fund its drug ambitions in the United States. So I wouldn't underscore the strategic interest of addressing the open border and the drug trafficking industry in the United States.
But if he tries to tell you that Trump is just doing this because of drug traffickers, they are woefully uninformed and very ignorant. Both people on the right and left know this is not about that. So since we have taken our heads out of the clouds and we know that this is not actually about protecting Americans from drugs, we can have real conversations about why America wants to have Venezuela on its side comparatively to our adversaries. First of all, Western influence is being challenged, and the tensions between the Western countries and the BRICS nations like Russia, China, and Iran is growing exponentially within the last few years. Venezuela is in the Western Hemisphere and South America and is a hotbed for our adversaries when it comes to planning, having a presence, and sourcing oil.
Okay, yes, this is all true. However, I would say one thing. BRICS is not a security alliance. It is an economic alliance which seeks to undermine the Bretton Woods system of the dollar standard when it comes to global trade. BRICS ultimately seeks to rival the dollar standard. Now, does that have downstream political effects, which also touch on security? Yes. Clark is right. There has been this axis of chaos, China, Russia, Iran, and then I would say tertiary powers in that axis are Venezuela, Qatar as well. Iran's war with Israel has also brought geopolitical tensions. So the time to act and deter our enemies is most definitely now. But I don't want to elevate the threat of BRICS to something it is not, because that's what Tucker Carlson uses to fearmonger the GOP, that if we antagonize or deter any of these countries, we're going to embark on World War III and we would lose. None of that is true.
So naturally, Western countries like the United States have a vested interest in neutralizing the geopolitical threat that is Venezuela. We rightfully so attempted to coerce Venezuela into listening to us by using sanctions, but that has not worked, especially as China, Russia, and Iran have increased their efforts to bring influence over into the Western Hemisphere and take influence away from the United States. Now, a lot of people are saying, why does America have to get involved in these conflicts?
Why can't we focus on problems at home? Why is it that there's always something going on around the world that America must put its paws on? And the answer is very simple. America is the global superpower. And when you are the global superpower, you
Global hegemonic power and superpower are interchangeable terms.
a lot of enemies because other countries want to be where you are. Meaning, if you want to hold on to the power that you have over basically the entire globe, it is a delicate balance between intervention and restraint. Now, America has been a little bit too interventionist in the past, and we have failed getting involved in issues that we shouldn't have. But we have also done a lot of good when it comes to getting involved because we have preserved our global dominance. It's also worth noting that America has preserved democratic ideals around the globe. And while America is the bad guy in many situations, sometimes there are two bad guys, but one is worse than the other. Ceding the power America has to nations like Russia, Iran, and China would objectively be worse for human flourishing. So the question that we have to ask ourselves when determining our opinion on Venezuela is this a time for restraint or intervention? And that is a loaded question. But if you are somebody who is always on the side of intervention or always on the side of isolation and restraint, then you're just a little bit naive, because in order to maintain our power, we have to have a balance of both. Now, when it comes to our involvement in Venezuela right now, while I am very happy for the people of Venezuela because he was a corrupt dictator who ruined that country, I am apprehensive that this move by the Trump administration is so blatantly aggressive in shoring up as much power as possible to avoid it falling in the hands of our adversaries, that it actually could get our adversaries to become more emboldened to move quicker on places like Taiwan. So remember earlier when I said that in order to preserve our power, we have to understand the balance between restraint and intervention? Every administration, including the Trump administration, the first one, as well as the Biden administration, has shown that we need to have restraint when it comes to Venezuela. So the question we need to ask is, what changed? What risk is so high that the Trump administration has to be this aggressive and upfront about shoring up more global influence over supply chains?
I don't even think it's just supply chains. I think it's also ideological influence and curving that. I don't think that this is going to encourage our adversaries to move quicker on Taiwan. This actually works as deterrence for that. It is a costly signal to China that if you mess with us, we are actually going to follow through on our stated doctrine. And in the case of Taiwan, it's the one China policy. If China were to invade Taiwan, it would trigger the US's military pact with the island to curb China's aggression. Clark mentions, well, why didn't the Biden administration intervene in Venezuela? The Biden administration's foreign policy was just weak foreign policy. Biden capitulated to all of our foreign adversaries abroad. There are ideological differences in how both presidents have chosen to run the country. Biden politicized aid to Israel because he was receiving internal pressure from his voting bloc as he had his mind set on the 2024 election. So what we saw the Biden administration do was capitulate to his anti-war Marxist base in order to yield political favorability or influence in the upcoming election. President Trump is not ideological. He is a zero-sum realist who looks at geopolitics in the terms of net gains for the United States. So I disagree with Clark on that. The other reason is because this is coming off of the wars and conflicts in the Middle East and in Russia and Ukraine, and we're seeing a growing influence of the axis of chaos. So he is right to point that out. Multiple things can be true at one time. This can be part of the war on terror in the United States. This can be part of curbing China, Russia, and Iran's influence in the Western Hemisphere. The Trump administration is now having to solve the problems that come with capitulating to our foreign adversaries. And what happened in Venezuela is just one step in reinstating American deterrence abroad. Remember, we've always had the hard power capabilities to deter our enemies. But that's only a deterrence if our adversaries believe that the United States is willing to uphold our stated policy positions. Appreciate Clark's position. That's the moderate position. I now want to turn to the woke right, because if there was any group of people, including someone like Tucker Carlson, who claims to be outraged at the crime, poverty, and homelessness of New York and Detroit, for example, that should be excited. A narco-terrorist such as Maduro has been apprehended and is being indicted in the United States on drug trafficking charges, it should be Tucker Carlson, right? Because he claims that this is one of the moral declines of the West. Drug use. He's looked to Sharia law, for example, in Qatar as maybe a positive alternative to the chaos and decline of the West. Ironically, it was Tucker interviewing a FARA registered agent of Venezuela to talk about how the Maduro regime is not that bad and they have lied to us, they of course being the elites and the Jews, was what tipped me off to Venezuela potentially heating up geopolitically. Tucker made sure to spin Maduro as potentially not that bad.
So the question is why? Why are we doing this? Why are we so opposed to Nicolás Maduro? So if you ask someone on the street, random person, why are we against Nicolás Maduro? The answer you're going to get is, who's Nicolás Maduro? But if you find someone in South Florida, for example, who knows who Nicolás Maduro is, who can identify where Venezuela is on a map, that person will almost certainly.
You could just hear Tucker's disdain for your average everyday American. It's like, in South Florida, they might be able to identify Venezuela on a map. But let me go ahead and tell you why communism is amazing.
Certainly say, well, because he's a communist or a socialist. He's exceedingly left-wing, and that is true. Nicolás Maduro and his government are very left-wing on economics, not on social policy, by the way, which is kind of interesting. In Venezuela, gay marriage is banned, abortion is banned, sex changes for transgenderism are banned. It's one of the very few countries in the entire hemisphere with those policies. It is on social policy, not defending the regime, just saying, one of the most conservative countries in North or South or Central America. Only El Salvador really comes close, which is much smaller, of course. And by the way, the U.S.-backed opposition leader who would take Maduro's place if he were taken out is, of course, pretty eager to get gay marriage in Venezuela. So to those of you who thought this whole project was global-homo, not crazy, actually.
Okay, so he's saying that the support in the U.S. for Maduro's opposition was because of the global-homo agenda, which, again, him and Candace claim is the Jews trying to infiltrate the West to adopt these anti-Christian values, and that is what has led to the moral decline of the West. It's a overly simplistic argument that lacks all nuance, historic context, and takes something that's bad, transgenderism, and then says, well, maybe the Maduro regime isn't that bad because they don't like transgenders. Well, the regime kills political opposition. It has economically ruined the country. Venezuelans can't even buy food for their families. And because of that, shadow governments and drug trafficking, human trafficking, the exploitations of humans, who Tucker claims to above all else care about because we are made in the image of God, is perhaps more important to address, even if that means backing a political opposition or candidate who supports gay marriage. But no, Tucker's pro-Maduro because he doesn't like the gays. Tucker Carlson recently gave a bizarre defense of Venezuela being socially conservative. And when was this? This was November 9th. Many were baffled. Turns out that Tucker's guest this Friday, Robert Amsterdam, is still an active FARA registered agent of Venezuela. Amsterdam earned $4 million plus in just the first 4 months of the engagement from the Maduro regime starting in January 2020. This podcast episode in November served as a piece of propaganda for the narco-terrorist state of Venezuela run by Maduro himself. But Tucker's America first. According to a relevant FARA filing, see below, Amsterdam was engaged to persuade the U.S. to mitigate or remove sanctions on Maduro's Venezuela. Here is another clip of Tucker defending Maduro.
Maduro, most people didn't know this, whatever his many faults, I wouldn't hire him as an economist, okay? But whatever his many faults, it has the most socially conservative country probably in the hemisphere. So Venezuela is just a fact. I mean, I didn't make this up. I'm not in charge of Venezuela. Just noticing that Venezuela has banned pornography, banned abortion, banned gay marriage, banned sex changes, and banned usury. You don't have
usury. The country is literally propped up by a regime that economically exploits its people. That is the definition of usury. And I promise you, pornography, human trafficking, prostitution, abortions are still happening in Venezuela. It's not some moral sanctuary.
credit cards with 40% interest in Venezuela. Okay. That credit cards with 40% interest in Venezuela.
I just had to laugh at that. Well, Tucker, the reason there's not credit cards in Venezuela with 40% interest rates, which that is I don't know what credit card you have. That is an extremely high APR. Both of my credit cards sit around 26% APR. But Tucker's saying, well, at least Venezuela doesn't have credit cards with a 40% interest rate. No, they just have a currency that is worth less than the paper it's printed on. So I think the last thing that the Venezuelan centralized bank can do is lend money to their people. It's not because they're just so kind and don't want to exploit financially their people. So now we have Candace Owens talking about Venezuela. And I'm just bringing this all up because a lot of what Tucker and Candace said was prior to the indictment of Nicolás Maduro, which also tells me that if they are getting ahead of potential geopolitical stories, then their lobbyist or their handlers must be very well connected and aware of downstream foreign policy, either fallout for their regimes or their ideological positioning or leaning. It's very interesting that they were talking about Venezuela, of all countries, months prior to the indictment of Maduro.
In Venezuela, because they had an election and their incumbent president, Nicolás Maduro, we all know who Nicolás Maduro is, and my suspicion is he's actually about to be killed, and I'll tell you why. Now, I just want to be clear, I am not a Nicolás Maduro apologist by any means whatsoever. I am just recognizing a very clear pattern here.
Notice how both Tucker and Candace preemptively say, well, I'm not an apologist for Maduro, but...
And I find it interesting that the regional leaders of other countries are demanding that they recount the votes. They are demanding essentially that the winner be declared Edmundo Gonzalez. They're calling it electoral scam. First among them, Milei in Argentina. Now, I want to be very clear. I don't trust anything that crawls out of Argentina with blue eyes. There's a reason for that. And that reason is because after World War II, a lot of Argentinians suddenly had blue eyes. And so I do not trust Milei. I'm happy to say that. Call it whatever you want. Something.
What the fuck is her point? Because she's a Nazi apologist. She's referring to the fact that Nazis went to Argentina after World War II, but I thought she loved the Nazis. So why is that then a cause for her not to trust the president of Argentina? Second off, she's commenting on the lack of free and fair election in Venezuela with absolutely zero foreign policy expertise. Almost every nation in the world recognized that this was a stolen election, and yet Candace is going to come to the defense of Maduro.
About him just reeks of a state plant to me, and how much the media is in love with him, and he just is doing the absolute most despite just getting into office. And so he has sort of led the pack, declaring this to be a fraud, not his country, but he's like, this is an absolute fraud. It is
not your country, Candace. You're not Venezuelan. Also, the fact that his eye color is the reason why she doesn't trust him. Her suspicions are always so shallow and unintelligent.
Wrong. He is demanding that Maduro publish proof of his victory, such as a district by district breakdown of vote tallies. Okay. So a neighboring country being led by Milei is demanding a breakdown district by district of the vote tallies. And Maduro is ignoring that, which is prompting further protests.
She's outraged that a president of a regional country is demanding for proof of a free and fair election in Venezuela. But isn't that what you're doing, Candy? A friend of a man publicly assassinated is demanding that the FBI share with her, someone who didn't have a current relationship with the assassined political figure, Charlie Kirk, the information that they have against Tyler Robinson. How crazy. So yeah, it is weird that another sovereign nation is sticking their nose into the elections of Venezuela. But why are you sticking your nose into the assassination and the investigation, demanding that everyone reveal their receipts, that everyone be accountable to you and you alone, because you are the judge, jury, and executioner of bringing Charlie Kirk's assassin to justice? It's ironic, isn't it? That's Candace's narcissism. I want to play Ben Shapiro's rebuttal to Tucker Carlson propping up Nicolás Maduro.
Tucker's made the point, I'm not going to here to be Tucker's defender, but he's made the point that Maduro is culturally conservative.
Who gives a shit? The guy's a communist dictator. Everyone in his country is eating dog. He's shipping fentanyl to the United States to kill Americans. Why do I give a shit whether he's anti-LGBTQ rights? This is the number one thing about Nicolás Maduro. You know how far down the list you have to get before you can get to anything remotely recommendable about Nicolás Maduro?
being anti-LGBTQ plus rights is at the very bottom of the list of what Nicolás Maduro has done to Venezuela. Now let's look at what Candace had to say and who she's blaming for the indictment of Nicolás Maduro. Venezuela has been liberated like Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq were liberated. The CIA has staged another hostile takeover of a country at the behest of a globalist psychopath, it would be a singular psychopath. Candace, your grammar. That's what is happening. Always, everywhere. Here we go, ladies and gentlemen. Zionists cheer every regime change. There has never been a single regime change that the Zionists have not applauded because it means they get to steal land, oil, and other resources. Hope this helps. Well, ironically, Israel actually just discovered their own oil reserves. So they don't need Venezuela's oil, for one. But yes, of course, Israel has interest in what's happening in Venezuela, largely because Hamas and Hezbollah have cell outposts in Venezuela. But here again with the CIA, run by the Jews, the globalist psychopaths, the agents of Israel, are coercively liberating countries where they have vested interest in. Forget the fact that Maduro exploited his own people, killed his political opposition, that Venezuelans are living in abject poverty, that they do not stand for anything a Western American Christian should stand for. Despite Venezuelans themselves cheering the indictment of Nicolás Maduro, Candace Owens is going to blame the Jews. Konstantin Kisin said the exact same thing as me. He said, I was going to make a joke about how these retards will claim Venezuela operation is Israel's fault, but they're actually legit claiming it's Israel's fault. Now, geopolitically, zooming out, what does this mean? I think that this is going to lower the revolutionary threshold in Iran for regime change. Now, Iran already has a huge youth movement calling for regime change. It has for many, many years at this point. But what happened in Venezuela is going to only further embolden the protesters and political opposition and protesters in Iran. President Trump said, if Iran shoots and violently kills peaceful protesters, which is their custom, which is true, the United States of America will come to their rescue. We are locked and loaded and ready to go. Thank you for your attention to this matter. I truly believe this is not just rhetorical. Venezuela serves as a warning that President Trump will follow through. This is the reinstatement of hard power deterrence, of American deterrence abroad. This is a net benefit for the United States. And to touch on BRICS before I close today, this is a net benefit for the United States. I will see you in the next episode.